The night sky off Long Island looked calm enough to pass for ordinary, the kind of midsummer evening where the heat finally broke and the air settled into a heavy stillness. At 8:31 p.m., TWA Flight 800 moved through that calm without incident, climbing through 14,000 feet as the coastline slipped behind it. Inside the cabin, passengers settled in for the long flight to Paris. Some flipped through seatback magazines, some leaned back with eyes closed, and others made last-minute calls from the onboard phones before the signal cut out. There was no hint that anything was wrong, no smoke, no shudder, no sound out of place. The aircraft was a Boeing 747, a workhorse of international travel, and nothing in its earlier flights suggested it wasn't ready for one more. In the cockpit, the flight crew monitored their climb. They expected to level off soon, join their assigned airway, and hand off communications like thousands of other flights did every day. Outside, the lingering traces of daylight caught the edges of the Atlantic, turning the water into a faint, uneven patchwork of blue and black. Boats dotted the coastline, some close enough for passengers to see their navigation lights blinking. Nothing about the view hinted at the disaster already forming deep inside the airplane. Beneath the cabin floor lay the center wing fuel tank, known as the CWT. It held only a small amount of jet fuel that night, far less than the outer tanks. What filled the rest was warm vapor, air mixed with fuel residues that had heated during the aircraft's time on the ground. Wiring ran across the tank, part of a system that managed the fuel quantity readings. For years, aviation regulators had known that aging insulation, chafing wires, and electrical spikes could create dangerous conditions inside tanks like these, but the broader system had been slow to change. None of that mattered to the passengers enjoying their drinks or watching the Atlantic pass beneath them. They had no reason to think the invisible problem under their feet was about to become fatal. At 8:31:12 p.m., an electrical signal traveled through a section of wiring that should never have held enough energy to do harm. Whether from a short, a surge, or a momentary arc, it reached the vapor-rich atmosphere inside the CWT. There was no warning, no flicker. In a fraction of a second, the vapors detonated. People on the ground saw it before anyone on the aircraft could process what had happened. Fishermen, beachgoers, and families finishing dinner along the Long Island shoreline looked up when a sudden bloom of light erupted high above the water. Some thought it was fireworks, some thought it was a flare, others thought they were watching a missile streak upward, an impression shaped by the fiery trail of burning fuel cascading from the aircraft as it broke apart. But there had been no missile, no bomb, only a violent internal explosion that shattered the 747's structure immediately. The cockpit separated first, tearing away so quickly that the flight crew never had a chance to radio a distress call. The nose section plummeted straight down. The remainder of the aircraft rose briefly, propelled by momentum, then disintegrated under aerodynamic forces. Passengers in the forward cabin never had time to react. Those farther back felt the violent jolt, the sudden loss of direction, and the tornado of air ripping through the fuselage. Then the cabin structure failed, and they were thrown into open sky. Debris rained into the Atlantic in a long, burning arc. Witnesses described seeing the horizon light up as flaming wreckage hit the water. Boats in the area raced toward the impact site, guided only by smoke and instinct. When they reached what remained of the aircraft, they found a field of floating debris: seat cushions, insulation, suitcases, and pieces of the fuselage still warm from the explosion. No survivors surfaced. The violence of the breakup and the height at which it occurred had given no one a chance. Within hours, a massive rescue effort shifted into a recovery operation. Coast Guard cutters, Navy vessels, divers, helicopters, and local fishing boats moved in to secure wreckage. Reporters gathered along the shoreline. Families waiting in terminals were told that contact had been lost with the flight. The truth followed soon after. The aircraft had gone down with all 230 people on board. Speculation exploded just as fast as the fuel tank had. Early radar signatures, eyewitness accounts, and the pattern of the breakup fueled theories of terrorism or a missile strike. The nation was already on edge in the mid-1990s, still shaken by the Oklahoma City bombing and earlier international attacks. Investigators had to approach the case with complete neutrality, sifting through thousands of potential clues while fighting a rising tide of rumors. The NTSB launched what would become one of the largest, most complex investigations in aviation history. Recovery teams hauled up nearly every major piece of the aircraft from the ocean floor, eventually reconstructing the fuselage inside a hangar on Long Island. Day after day, divers retrieved fragments under unforgiving conditions, guided by a grid system that mapped where each piece had landed. The CWT area drew immediate interest. Its remains showed inward buckled metal, scorching and patterns of stress consistent with a fuel-air explosion, not an external strike. Investigators traced the initiating event to the wiring for the fuel quantity indication system. Tests showed that the worn insulation and potential electrical anomalies could have allowed a spark to jump into the tank. The heat from air conditioning units located beneath the tank had raised the temperature of the remaining fuel to the point where vapors became dangerously volatile. All it took was one spark. Years of analysis confirmed the internal explosion scenario. No chemical residues consistent with explosives were found. No impact signatures matched a missile. The breakup sequence, burn patterns, debris distribution, and recovered flight data all pointed to a catastrophic fuel tank failure triggered by faulty wiring, an issue that had been documented in other aircraft types, but never corrected on a wide scale. Families of the victims faced not only their loss, but also the weight of misinformation that continued to circulate long after the physical evidence had been analyzed. The NTSB report, released 4 years after the crash, laid out the chain of events clearly. Vapors in the center wing tank ignited, the tank exploded, the aircraft broke apart, and all 230 lives were lost within seconds. The disaster led to major reforms in aviation safety. Fuel tank inerting systems became standard. Wiring inspections tightened. Manufacturers redesigned tank layouts and electrical systems to reduce the risk of ignition. Every commercial aircraft flying today carries lessons forged from the wreckage of Flight 800. Yet the human dimension remains the hardest part to absorb. The passengers who boarded expecting an overnight flight to Paris never knew the danger. The crew who guided the aircraft through its climb never saw the failure coming. Families who waited for updates learned that the most ordinary warm summer evening had turned into something irreversible in a single flash beneath an airplane's floor. TWA Flight 800 remains one of the most wrenching examples of how a hidden flaw, left unaddressed, can destroy an entire aircraft in seconds. The cause was traced, the systems were changed, but the impact on the families and the lessons for the industry have never faded. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.